was awesome. We can applaud that. You can applaud. The kids, man, the kids doing ministry. Kids at Christmas time. I mean, am I right? I mean, it's so fun, right? Imaginations. And we've been waking up. I don't want to spill too many secrets, but we've been waking up at like 4 o'clock every morning to make sure our home is ready for Christmas magic. Because when they get up, we want their imaginations, their little imaginations to explode. You guys remember what that was like, right? I mean, we do our best. We do our best at Christmas time to incorporate, to motivate, to stimulate the imaginations of kids. I mean, all of us, whether you're parents, grandparents, whether you're uncles or aunts, anybody who's got a kid involved in their life, we do our best at Christmas time to engage the imagination of our children again. Whether they're our nieces or our nephews or our own kids or our neighbors' kids or friends of ours, right? It's about engaging their imaginations. And we all remember as children having our imaginations stimulated, right? Having our imaginations lit up during the Christmas season. But the interesting thing for us adults, for us grown-ups, I think it's easy for us to forget. I think it's so easy for us to forget that the first Christmas was not planned, right? Everything about that first Christmas, let me say it this way, was unimaginationable, which is not a word, but it should be. That first Christmas was unimaginationable. In other words, it's really, it was unimaginable. Nobody imagined, you know this, nobody was looking forward to, nobody predicted, nobody thought it was going to happen, nobody was praying for, nobody was wishing for, nobody saw coming. A virgin Galilean peasant girl giving birth to a son. I mean, this was completely 100% unexpected. It was unimaginable. And then once it happened, as you go through the story, once it happened, no one imagined that her baby, her son, would grow up to be the most famous rabbi who ever lived. Maybe not necessarily the most popular one, but certainly the most remembered one, the most famous one. And nobody would have ever predicted, nobody could have imagined that the storyline of his life, that he would grow up and he would gather a small following right there in the middle of the heart of Israel during a time of Roman occupation, that he would start a new movement, a new gathering, and then he would have the audacity. And again, we read this in the New Testament, it just goes right over our heads because we don't live in that culture. But nobody would imagine that any rabbi, much less this one, would claim to be greater than Moses, greater than the temple, greater than, or in his words, Lord of the Sabbath. I mean, all of these things were so offensive. And no one would imagine that this peasant girl's baby son would grow up one day to become such a threat to the temple and then eventually to the entire Roman Empire, at least regionally, that he would be arrested and crucified and buried. And seriously, no one, not even his closest followers, not even his own mother, no one imagined that he would be raised from the dead, or that his movement would actually outlast the temple, outlast the empire, which everybody thought was eternal, that the empire that crucified him, this is amazing, the empire that crucified him would eventually turn around and embrace the son of this Nazarene peasant girl as God. No one could imagine that. No one could imagine that the icon for this son, this Rabbi Jesus, that the icon would be a Roman cross and that it would be recognized all over the world for generations to follow. The entire story, the entire narrative from start to finish was unimaginable, impossible, right? This should have never happened. But here's the thing that I don't want us to miss. We don't have to imagine any of that because here we are, right? We are here because of all that. And regardless of what you believe about different parts of the story, what's undeniable is here we are. right? And the church all over the world, large and small, for generations and generations, different languages, different traditions, different customs. During this season, people all over the world, men and women from that time forward, have worshiped and recognized Jesus as the Son of God, a God who came to the earth to live among us and to show us the way forward. It's unimaginable that it happened, but it did happen. And here we are. And here's what I want to talk about for the next few minutes. There is something that we all should imagine. And Christmas is the perfect time to imagine it, right? Christmas reminds us that sometimes, you guys know this, that the unimaginable is in fact the possible. That the unimaginable is in fact the possible. It's what does happen. And if you're a Christian, for the next few minutes, I'm gonna ask you to loan me your imagination. Just loan me your imagination for the next few minutes as we imagine something together. If you're here, you're not a Christian, maybe you used to be a Christian, maybe you just somehow walked away from the faith, or you're revisiting it, whatever it might be. What we're about to imagine, if it actually came to pass, you might consider becoming a follower of Jesus, right? You might consider rejoining us, because what we're about to imagine is not a reality. And the fact that it's not a reality might be part of the reason that you don't follow Jesus. So today we're wrapping up our series called Joy to the World. And as we've said the last couple of times that we've been together, one of Jesus' most controversial and offensive statements is also one of his most quoted statements. You remember this, even if you're not a church person, if you didn't grow up in the church, you grew up outside of the church, you've probably heard this before. Maybe it was offensive to you, but that's understandable. At one point in Jesus' ministry, he made this audacious claim. I mean, no one would say this, right? Who would say this? He said, speaking of himself, he goes, I am, you guys remember this? I am the way, the truth, and the life. And nobody from any generation, nobody comes to the Father, speaking of God the Father, no one comes to God the Father except through me. I mean, who would say such a thing? Who would say such a thing? Of course, there are many things that Jesus said that when you read them, you go, who would say such a thing? And it's the reason that many of his followers eventually abandoned him, right? It was just too much. It wasn't what Jesus taught that was offensive. Loving others and being kind and forgiving and patient. What Jesus taught wasn't offensive. It was what he said about himself that was offensive. And ultimately, that got him crucified. And this is one of those statements that's on the surface. It is so offensive. I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. But the problem with this statement, which you said last week, while it's usually interpreted as an attempt to be exclusive, it's usually interpreted as an attempt to exclude people. When you follow Jesus through the Gospels, clearly this was never his goal. Clearly this was not his intent. He wasn't drawing smaller circles. Jesus was always trying to draw bigger circles. He was attempting to be so inclusive, to expand the circle, right? He wasn't trying to be exclusive that it left more and more people out. He was trying to include everybody. I mean, one of the most famous verses in the Bible is, for God so loved who? The world, right? And that was Jesus' point, that God has always loved the whole world, the entire world, all the people in the world, not just the sons and the daughters of Abraham, but he chose the sons and the daughters of Abraham through whom he could bring himself into the world, so that the entire world could know how much God loved them. And then Jesus claimed to be the way back to God. First, by explaining God. Because God to them was a little bit of a mystery, right? It would be helpful if somebody could come down and demonstrate what God is like, demonstrate what God likes, how he acts, how he reacts. And so Jesus said, you want to know what God is like? Look at me. If you want to know what the Father is like, look at me. And then ultimately, he literally became the way to God. Not just the ways of God, but the way to God, by removing the primary obstacle between us and him, between you and your Heavenly Father, between me and my Heavenly Father. He specifically removed our sin. But as we discovered last time, there's something else embedded in this claim. Right? Something else baked into the idea of him being the way, that Jesus actually came to model and call us not simply to believing something, we said this last week, but to model and call us into a way of life, a way to live, the way of Jesus. Right? And if you're a Christian, it's to this way of life that I want to try to wrap our imaginations around for just a moment. If you're a Christian, it's this way of life that I want to engage your imaginations as we try to picture it. So here we go. Imagine a world. Imagine your world. Imagine our world. Imagine where there are people in this world who are skeptical of what we believe, right? Because we believe some wacky things. We believe that a man was raised from the dead. He was sent by God to illustrate God, to be worshiped as God. Imagine a world, imagine your world, imagine our world where people, rightly so, are skeptical of what we believe because we believe some wacky things, but are amazed at how well we talk about, care for, support, and show up for one another. A world where Christians don't worship the same way, where Christians don't interpret the Bible the same way, where Christians don't approach worship or communion or baptism the same way, a world where Christians don't all vote the same way, right? But that those differences never, ever, ever, ever divide us from one another. Imagine a world. Imagine your world, imagine our world, imagine your community where people outside of our faith tradition, who are part of another faith tradition or are part of no faith tradition whatsoever, are moved by, impressed by, amazed by, taken aback by, astounded by our no strings attached concern, care, and love for people who are nothing like us and may not even like us. Right? Imagine a world where people outside our faith tradition who are skeptical of what we believe, because we believe some wacky things, are anxious to hire us, to work for us, to live next door to us, to marry their sons and their daughters off to us, because we're Christians. And as Christians, as followers of Jesus, our predictable and extraordinary character makes them thankful that we're here, because our work ethic and our self-control and our reliability, because of our honesty. Imagine a world where the traits that define the reputation of Christians, both individually and corporately, collectively, a world where people drive by churches and think to themselves, you know what? I am so glad they're in our community. Our world is better. They drive by churches and think, you know what? Our community is better off because they're here. Our kids are safer because they're here. Our children are better off because the Christians are here. That when they hear there's going to be a new church in town, people rejoice. They don't necessarily believe what we believe, but they're so thankful because of our reputation that we're moving in to that community. Imagine a world. It's going to be a harder one. Imagine a world where we are known for protecting the rights of others more than we're known for protecting our own rights. Imagine a world where we're known for protecting and safeguarding the rights of others before demanding our own. In short, imagine a world where Christians embraced the way of Christ, the way of Jesus, the ways of Jesus. The posture and the tone and the humility of Jesus. A world where it was evident that we were as committed to behaving correctly as we are believing correctly. Maybe it's just me. And Jess. Is that too much for us to imagine? At Christmas, when we celebrate that God became one of us to show us the way forward, to show us the way to live, the way to be better people, to create a better world, to create a safer world, to create a culture where everybody feels the dignity of being made in the image of God. Should it be hard for us to imagine, with as many Christians as there are in our communities, or as many people as there are in our nation, or as many people that call themselves Christians that are here, would it be so unordinary, so impossible to imagine, like Christians actually reminding people of Christ? Isn't it strange I even have to say that? Right? And if you're not a Christian, you're in the room, somebody invited you today, you're watching online, whatever. If you're not a Christian, this is why, isn't it? If you're not a Christian, this is why the pushback. It's not that you don't believe what we believe. It's more than that. You're not convinced we believe it, right? You have every right not to be convinced. We're so divided. And come on, if we can't unite, if we can't get along with ourselves, why in the world would anybody else want to be a part of that? You're not convinced we believe the things that we say we believe. And honestly, at times, I'm not really convinced that we do either. But what if we did? What if our behavior was more important than what we believed? What if we wrapped our behavior and our priorities? It's so simple, it's so out there, and it's so unimaginable. But we have Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, the apostles that came right after Jesus. We have the apostle named Paul in particular who said, this is what it looks like. This is what it looks like, guys. This is what it acts like. This is what it reacts like to follow Jesus. But what makes this even stranger than that is that this unimaginable world that I've described, it shouldn't be unimaginable because it happened 2,000 years ago. And I've reminded you over and over and over, and I'll continue to remind you that once upon a time, not the beginning of a fairy tale, not even the beginning of history, but the beginning of our history. Once upon a time, the others first culture of the church stood in sharp contrast to the me first, bite and devour culture that the church was birthed in, where might determined right, where women were considered property, where children were disposable and had no value and no honor. They didn't even name their kids because they weren't sure they even wanted to have them until later. Where compassion, and this is so hard for us to imagine because we have the leftovers. We have the shadow of Christianity in our culture, where compassion and generosity were actually considered character flaws. And along comes a group of people called Christians who say, no, those aren't character flaws. Those are virtues. And somehow that took hold. Once upon a time, there were communities of Jesus followers who literally, and that's our problem, because when we read things that Jesus said and we don't want to do them, we go, well, that couldn't have been literal, right? We must be able to explain or exegete that away. Surely we can't put that into practice. That would never work. Our lives would never work. But once upon a time, there were people who did, who were like, yeah, if he said to do that, maybe we should do that. There were communities of Jesus followers who literally embraced the inconvenient, countercultural, can't possibly work way of Jesus. Right? And this Nazarene cult, which is what it was called, a Nazarene cult, because it was like this knockoff Jewish religion. There were Jewish people who they thought had abandoned traditional Judaism, had decided to do their own thing and started a cult. That's how it was perceived. A Nazarene sect, a Nazarene cult. And these members of this Nazarene cult were initially viewed with suspicion. They're like, what's the catch? What are they doing in there? What are they doing behind closed doors? What do these people want? And over time, that suspicion turned to curiosity. And then eventually the peacemakers outnumbered the peacekeepers who came to worship and follow the Prince of Peace. And this is the other part we can't imagine because we're so segmented in our society. But in these early ecclesias, these early gatherings of Jesus followers, one day a week before the sun rose, the first day of the week, which was a work day, they would gather slaves and slave owners, right? Freedmen and citizens and men and women and children, these little ecclesias, these little gatherings of Jesus followers. And it grew and it grew and it grew. Not primarily because of what Christians believed. They had no literature. They had no Bible. There were fragments, little bits of this, little bits of that. Somebody might have this or a copy of the Gospel of Matthew, but there's no literature. There's no Bible study, right? What brought these people together wasn't what they believed at first. It was the way Christians behaved. They were the best citizens, guys. Right? When Roman governors, there's historical evidence of this. When Roman governors were told to round up Christians and execute them if they wouldn't sacrifice to Caesar, some of the governors wrote back to the emperor, were like, oh, hold on, are you sure? Like, wait a minute. These guys aren't lawbreakers, right? I mean, yeah, they won't burn incense to the emperor, but they're like the best husbands, right? They're more faithful to their wives than the other people. They're the best citizens. They pay their taxes. They submit to our authority. Like, what was the difference? Because they took the teaching of Jesus literally and they lived it out, and consequently, they stood out. And the church grew and grew and grew. And what started off as suspicious became curious. And then it was like an avalanche. People from every segment of life flocked to the ecclesia of Jesus. Again, not primarily because of what Christians believed, but because of the way Christians lived their lives. Now, they had a little bit of an advantage. Right? Mostly disadvantaged, they're like 99% disadvantaged, but they had a little bit of an advantage, right? They understood, unlike us, the world of kings and kingdoms. And they understood too that once they acknowledged that Jesus was literally a physical king, we talked about this several months ago, he's literally a physical king, not a spiritual one, not a metaphysical one. They literally believed that Jesus was a physical king, right? And once they acknowledged that he was a literal physical king, they submitted to his rule. Right? They submitted to his authority. They understood that if you're devoted to a king, then you obey the laws of the king, right? It's his kingdom. If you recognize someone as your king, you're devoted to the rules of the king. And so they submitted to whatever Jesus said. And they also understood that if you disregard the rules of a king, you're a traitor. To disregard the rules of the king is to betray the ruler. And this is why, and we've talked about this before, this is why the early followers of Jesus were eventually dubbed or called or branded Christian. This was not a name they gave themselves. This was a slur. Right? This was Latin political terminology. It wasn't a word that Jesus' followers came up with and said, this is what we should call ourselves. This is what they were called by the outside world. People who didn't know what to do with them. It was 100% political, not religious, right? Christian, the word Christian is actually political terminology from Latin. A follower of Jesus is called a Christian, let me say it this way. A follower of Caesar was called a Ciceroni. Right? A follower of Caesar was a Ciceroni. And the Gentiles in Antioch looked around at this strange group of people who lived this entirely different kind of life, and others first kind of life. This group of people who, when they were tested, it was clear they were devoted to a different king with a different kingdom somewhere else, right? A king that they said had actually come to this earth and walked among them and modeled for them what it's like to follow God, and had died and been raised back to life, right? And that he rules now from heaven. And they believed he ruled in a different realm. They were to be as devoted to him in their behavior as they would be to a Caesar or to a governor or any kind of ruler placed over them. So they were dedicated. And outsiders went, gosh, those people feel about Jesus the way we feel about Caesar. Ciceroni, Christiane, Christian. This was Latin political language, but it was a problem. It was a problem for the Roman Empire, because for the Roman Empire, Rome didn't care which gods people worshiped. I don't know if you knew this or not. When they conquered a region, they didn't make people worship Roman gods. They couldn't care less, right? They didn't take away the local gods. You can worship any gods you want. You can do whatever you want for your local gods. Rome's concern was 100% political. They allowed for as many gods as people wanted, but only one king, one ruler, one emperor, one Caesar. Rome's mandate was this: worship your Christ. We don't care. But you obey Caesar, right? Worship your Christ. We don't care how you worship him. Like worship, we don't care what your traditions are. You can do you can burn incense. You can burn animals. You can burn each other. We don't really care. You worship your Christ any way you want. You have freedom of worship. But at the end of the day, your ultimate allegiance is to Caesar. And this was a problem for the early Christians, because Jesus wasn't like the pagan gods. The pagan gods did not demand obedience. The pagan gods didn't have any rules. The pagan gods just want to sacrifice. It was sort of this superstitious thing, right? It's a good luck charm. If you wanted things to go well for you, you burn incense or whatever, you make a sacrifice for the blessing of the gods, right? No one knows how many gods there are, so worship as many as you want, burn as much. But they never asked for anything as a result. For the Christians, this was different because their God had come to earth, and he had come to earth as a king. And he ruled in the kingdom of heaven. And he had left his kingdom on earth, and his kingdom required submission and obedience. So in the first century, no one was ever asked whether or not they were a Christian. They were accused of it. It was evident. The way they lived was testimony to who they followed. Their king, he'd modeled a way. He'd modeled the way. And in modeling the way, at the end, he left them, and you guys know this because we talk about it all the time, he left them with one single overarching command, a governing ethic that was the standard against which all of their behavior, all of their actions, all of their reactions would be measured and evaluated. And then after Jesus left, the apostles, they went into the Gentile world, our world, and they said, this is what it looks like to live out this one single command, right? This is what it looks like to live out this overarching command. This is what it looks like as husbands. This is what it looks like as wives. This is what it looks like as children, as citizens. This is how you live out this overarching command under the authority of earthly rulers, and even how you respond to your enemies. And as we all know, but so easily forget, the way of Jesus, with the way of Jesus, this one overarching command is to instruct all the followers of Jesus, right? And it characterized, it defined, it was summarized, all of this by one single word, one of my favorite words. Right? This one overarching command can be summarized and baked into this one single term that appeared in that culture and in our culture at times as weak and passive, as an effeminate virtue. And it's this word, agape. Agape. Love. Others first love. A love where you put the good of the other ahead of your own, where you will their best before your own. So naive, so simplistic, right? Guys, that's not how the game is played. That's not how the game was played then. That's not how the game is played now. Am I right? I mean, this is not how the world works. This is not how progress is made. Love, come on. Love is not a winning strategy. In fact, it isn't even a strategy. If it's a strategy for anything, it's a strategy for losing. And if this sounds impractical, I understand the pushback. It sounds impractical to us. It sounded even more impractical to them. It sounded so impractical. Can you imagine being one of the 12 that night at dinner with Jesus? The night before his death. The night he was arrested, and they're sitting around the table, right? They're sitting with Jesus, their rabbi, for their final Passover meal. And he knows what hangs in the balance. He knows he's going to be arrested. He knows he's going to be given a mock trial in the middle of the night. He knows he's going to be tortured. He knows he's going to be hung on the cross. And before all of that takes place, he has them lean in. He goes, okay, guys, I need you to hear me on this. Everything I've ever taught you, everything you've ever seen, all of my actions, all of my reactions, all of my messages, all of my sermons, all of my miracles, all the things you've ever heard, all of it comes down to this one new command, this one new ethos, this one new rule. And it's this rule that you should come back to over and over and over after I'm gone. Whenever you're not sure what to do, you just come back to this one simple idea. And they're all leaned in. Because they're in the lion's den, guys. They're in Jerusalem at Passover. The religious leaders in Rome hold all of the cards. They control the crowd. Things are about to pop off. And the best Jesus can do, the only thing he had, his final marching order, is this. As I have loved you, So you must love one another. Wait, seriously, Jesus? That's the plan? That's good. You got love? Love, come on. If this subversive empire-threatening idea reaches Rome, right? If Caesar hears that we're going to love each other, I mean, he won't be able to sleep, right? That's just so scary. Jesus, if the high priest down the street catches wind of this, he's probably going to pack up and flee the city, right? Oh no, we're doomed. The Christians, they're going to love one another, right? I mean, come on. What kind of rule is that? What kind of king is that? What kind of kingdom is that? See, the reason this shouldn't be hard for us to imagine is because the Roman Forum is a tourist attraction now. Right? Herod's magnificent temple, the epicenter of power in that region, you can visit it today. The temple, its leftovers, the remains are scattered around the base of the walls. It's in ruins. And Herod and Tiberius and Caesar, you only know their names because they became footnotes in the story of a peasant girl who had a baby, and that baby became a king. And that king is whom the modern church has never fully submitted. And maybe you've never fully submitted because you think he allows too little or requires too much. And yet he came to show you and he came to show me the way to live, the way to his Father, the way of the Father, the way you were created to live. And what we know is that when we live against that grain, we pay. Right? When we do marriage against that grain, we pay. When we approach life against that grain, instead of with the grain of how we were created to live, we create our own regret. And that's why he's a king and not a counselor and not an advisor and not simply a rabbi. He's the king in whose name you pray when your child is sick. Am I right? He's the king in whose name you pray when your marriage is in jeopardy. He's the king whose kingdom you claim to be a part of when tragedy strikes. He's the king in whose name you pray when your heart is broken. And come on, in those moments, isn't this true? In those moments, doesn't your king, he has your undivided attention, doesn't he? He has your unwavering loyalty until the danger passes. But imagine a world where believers chose to live as followers every single day. Followers of the way and the ways of Jesus, who came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for you, to give his life as a ransom for me, to give his life as a ransom for many. The Apostle Paul, who thought all of this was absurd, by the way, he thought all of this was nonsense, right? When he makes his way onto the pages of scriptures, he's hearing about Jesus and this little cult, this Nazarene cult, and he goes, "Are you kidding me? This is nonsense. This is a cult. It's a sect. It's diluting Judaism. It's diluting the ways of our forefathers. It must be stamped out." And so he goes and he gets himself deputized. It's a fascinating story. He's a Pharisee. He's a great Pharisee. He's like, "I'm the best Pharisee I've ever seen," right? And he decides that he's going to single-handedly stamp out the people, the members of the way, because it's in the way and it's causing a disruption. And Rome is wondering whether or not they can continue to give religious freedom to that area of the world because things are getting a little bit crazy. And Paul's like, we got to shut this down because they're getting the attention of the empire. And so Paul, who previous to this is named Saul of Tarsus decides, I'm going to do away with this. And so he gets himself deputized. You guys remember the story? And he heads to Damascus to arrest members of the way. And then he runs into the way, God. He runs into the way on his way, and he meets the resurrected Jesus. He meets the way. And he doesn't just change what he believes. He changes his whole way of living. And then he travels around the Mediterranean basin. His job was impossible. His job was completely unimaginable. To just walk into pagan cultures and go, hey, I got a different kind of religious belief. In fact, everything that you think is wrong. What your parents did was wrong. What your grandparents did was wrong. There's no gods. You're wrong about that, right? Your parents were wrong. There's a God up there who's been waiting for the day to reveal this to you for your sake and your benefit. And this message of his about a God who's been looking for people, it began to take root in Ephesus and in Corinth and Colossae and Thessalonica and all these port cities and all these major cities. And back at home, Paul sits down and he decides to write to one of these churches, the church at a place called Ephesus. And here's what he says to them. And here's what he says to you. And here's what he says to me. And just imagine if we did this. He says, Ephesians 5, 1 and 2, he says, I want you to follow God's example. What? Follow God's example. Why? This is not news, right? You're made in the image of God. Everybody you come eyeball to eyeball with is made in the image of God. That means I have dignity and you have dignity and you have worth. And it doesn't matter if they're male or female. Everybody who's born has worth. Everybody who's ever been born, was just about all of us, because we're made in the image of God. And Paul goes, oh yeah, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that you should follow God's example, because being made in the image of God means that you are a picture of God. You are a reflection of God. What God values, you're to value. What God likes, you're to like. What God reacts like is what you're to react like, because he sent his son to live this out in front of you, and you know what that is now because you've seen him live it out. So follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children. You're to be like your heavenly Father, right? But then listen to how he summarizes this. He says, and walk or live and walk in the way of love. Isn't that beautiful? Walk in the way of love. Do you know what that means? That every time you're not sure what to do, every time you're not sure how to react or act, every time you're not sure what to say or how to feel, every time you simply ask this question, what does love require of me? What does love require of me? When you're not sure what to say or do, it's okay. Go back to this starting point, Paul says. What does love require of me? Back to this one command. Back to the thing that's supposed to characterize me and characterize us. What does love require of me? This idea changed a civilization once. And it can't be improved upon. And I know it sounds soft, but consider this. The way of love culminated in a king surrendering himself to his enemies to be crucified for their sins. And the only reason we even know some of the names of his enemies now is because they are footnotes in the story of our king. But imagine a world where the Christians literally followed God's example, like Paul says. Where the Christians followed God's example and walked in the way of love. Imagine a world, imagine a community, imagine our community, imagine your community where the Christians, regardless of their brand, regardless of when they worship or how they worship or the music they listen to, imagine if the Christians in our community decided we're going to walk in the way of love because that's the way of God. And God's example is for us lived out in Jesus. It's why he sent his son to be the way in a manger. Why is this so hard to imagine? Let's go do that. I mean, it all starts with somebody or some somebodies. That's how the whole thing started that way. A handful of people who decided we're going to take seriously the way and the ways of Jesus, the way of God our Father, the way of love. So while they were still there, Mary and Joseph, while they were still there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. And she wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and we can all say this part together, and placed him in a manger. Imagine that. Imagine that. The way that once upon a time changed the world in a manger. Right? The way that has the potential to change the world again. If I choose, if you choose, if we choose the way of love, the way of Jesus, the way of Christ, our King. Maybe someday we'll do more than just imagine. So, Heavenly Father, why not us? Why not me? Why not today? Why not tomorrow? Why not this afternoon? Why not my time? Why not my resources or my words or my actions and reactions? Oh, Heavenly Father, would you please, in this divided world, in our divided nation, in our hurting community, would you give us, those of us who claim to be your followers, would you give us the courage to come up out of hiding, out of the trenches, to just come up and come out and embrace the way of Jesus and see what happens. So wherever this lands with us, God, would you give us wisdom to know what to do with it? And then, not just the wisdom, would you give us the courage to actually do it? Starting today, starting with lunch, starting with dinner, starting with the way we celebrate Christmas this week. Would you please do what only you can do and just instill such a burden in each of us that won't be satisfied unless we're a part of that kingdom, your kingdom, come to earth, here as in heaven, in the form of a child.